Yeah, as Noshir said, I wrote a book over the pandemic. It's a book that had been in various forms, disconnected material that I had worked since about 2006. And the fact that we were on a lockdown in here allowed me to put it all together and finish. So everything that I'm going to say is somewhere in the book, though not all the slides that I'm going to show you are part of that. So, but the main question in here, what happens if the thinkings that go in art, technology, and science? And art, by the way, as you will see, I'm going to focus mostly on modern and contemporary art. But I'm going to start the story, basically, you will see, close to Florence, really. And we'll start with the question or the point of view when art, technology, and science were one, why they separated, and what would happen if they join up again, okay? So the story that I want to start is with this. Galilei, who was, according to people like Steve Hawking, the greatest physicist of them all, the person who started modern science, and Thomas Harriot. Galileo was mostly in Padua, Florence, Pisa, and Thomas Harriot was in London. They both came across what now you will call a telescope. But at the time that these things were created by the Dutch, they were not so used to look at the skies. They were sold as devices that will tell you the advance of troops. You will see them at the distance. But for various reasons, Harriot and Galileo decided to point, for the first time ever, these perspective tubes or optical tubes, they were not called telescopes then, to look at the skies. And the first thing that they decided to look at was the moon. Now, you will say there is nothing controversial about this, except that up to that point, the moon was supposed to be a perfect sphere. It was the symbol of purity. The Virgin was sometimes portrayed sitting on top of it. And all the astronomy up to that point, even Galileo had to teach Ptolemaic astronomy. All of this came from the Greeks and Aristotle. The skies were immutable. The moon was perfection itself. You can say, well, I can see spots. They have lots of reasons why to explain this, but they both look at the moon at the same time. Harriot in London, Galileo mostly in Florence. So the example that I'm going to give you is about the value of intersections, the intersection between art, technology, and science. The technology has to do with these optical tubes, but also the question of what we call emergence. And emergence is what happens when several disconnected things produce an output that is more than the sum of the parts. Now, London at that point was way, way behind Florence. And what Galileo had in Florence was the Accademia dell'Arte del Disegno. This was founded in 1563 by Cosimo di Medici, but under the influence of Giorgio Vasari. Vasari was probably the first art historian. So they both look at the moon, and Harriot drew this ink drawing that you see on the left, and Galileo was a very accomplished artist. In fact, he was elected to l'Accademia del Disegno on his strength as an artist, drew these watercolors. And he kind of looked at the shadows as a function of time. These are more, again, the drawing from Harriot on the left, Galileo's on the right, and even there is an etching in there based on the drawings of Galileo that was put in the book, The Starry Messenger by Galileo. But Galileo had a significant advantage over Harriot because Galileo had l'Accademia del Disegno behind him, and the people who were aspiring artists, architects, sculptors, they all were supposed to know about perspective, and they were able to draw things or study things like the objects that you see in there with shadows and so on and so forth. So they both had the same image in front of them, but Galileo saw more because he had this backing of perspective from what was existing in Florence. So I'm going to tell you more about perspective. And Galileo was even able to calculate the height of the craters of the moon based on science, accompanied by his observations about art, being able to see more than Harriot. And as you imagine, this is the intersection between the technology of the optical tubes, the science of math that Galileo had, the technology, and all the things were going on in Florence. These studies on perspectives was Galileo's edge. And Harriot did not have access to that in London. So let's leave in, for the moment, the perspective piece in there. But close to where you are, the Florence Cathedral around 1400 looked like this. But the citizens of Florence were so confident in their ability to be able to solve problems that they had built the cathedral without having a plan to build the dome in there. There were domes elsewhere. One dome was in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, built by Justinian with the assistance of two Greek mathematicians. But the one that they paid special attention was the one in Rome, the Pantheon, which was built 500 years before Hagia Sophia, and is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. So the citizens of Florence opened a competition to see who could build this dome. And two people who had really not experienced as architects, Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi, participated in the competition. Eventually, Brunelleschi won the competition. And all the plans that he had in there on how to build even the machines that will help you build, they are all lost. But one thing that Brunelleschi had, if there is someone who could be called the father of perspective, is Brunelleschi. And I want to show you how these things link with some of the key figures in Florence reaching up to Galileo at that point. So this is Brunelleschi. He lived for 69 years. And he was followed by this guy, Leon Bautista Alberti, who was probably the most prototypical Renaissance person who ever lived, much more than Leonardo da Vinci, for example. And Alberti was the one who codified the Brunelleschi's ideas, encapsulated in Brunelleschi's mirror, by the way, then this Alberti's window, and then Galileo's perspective tubes, in a way that this could be popularized more. He wrote three books, one on architecture, one on sculpting, and one on painting. By the way, he was followed by Leonardo. They overlap, as you can see here. For the standards of the time, these people lived for a long while. The median age was probably 35. And then Michelangelo, who lived up to 1989, overlapped with Leonardo. And what is really interesting is Galileo was born 3 days before Michelangelo's death. And this takes us up to the time of Michelangelo. And l'Accademia del Disegno, Vasari's, was done like 2 years before Galileo was born. So he had all of this to learn from. By the way, in another coincidence, Isaac Newton and Galileo died and were born the same year. So all of this was a time in which, up to Galileo, the beginning of science, art, technology, and science were one, really. But then eventually they separated. And why they separated? Because the people who were running city-states, Florence was one, Padua was another one, Venice was another one, they discovered the use of math, and I'm typifying this by Niccolo Tartaglia. Tartaglia was someone who wrote this book, was a new science, but was basically about all the trajectory of projectiles. These people knew how to build fortifications. In fact, Da Vinci was in that business as well. And what tilted the balance, abandoning, until that point, the idea of innovation was not really something that was in the air. All the knowledge was associated with the Greeks until sort of Brunelleschi, and even up to the time of Galileo, he was teaching Ptolemaic astronomy. So these city-states decided that they could fund people, including Da Vinci, and art and science kind of separated because science was seen as something useful and was becoming more disassociated from art. Now, there are lots of times in which art, science, and technology converge. Louis Pasteur, who, when he was young, was an accomplished artist, was the fellow who discovered chirality, and chirality has, as you know, DNA coils in one direction. If DNA had coiled in some other way, in the opposite direction, life will be completely different. So chirality is about things that live in one way and mirror image in the other way. So he's one example of art, technology, and science converging. Another one more recent is Poincaré, who in many ways anticipated the things of that relativity from Einstein. The idea is that hyperdimensional spaces could influence people in art. There's documentation on how Duchamp, for example, was influenced by Poincaré, who was probably the most famous mathematician of his time in France. And the ideas that Poincaré had written about were even absorbed by people in the circle of Picasso. Another example has to do with a fellow who was the father of quantum mechanics, really. And this is Niels Bohr. The picture in there is a picture of Niels Bohr study in Copenhagen. And the picture that is on the right, which I'm going to show you next, was a picture written by, not written, was produced by this fellow Jan Metzinger, who was also a theorist. He wrote this book about the theory of cubism. And this picture, there's no historical reference that Bohr ever read this book, okay? But Bohr selected this picture because the idea of seeing several things in the picture is central to the idea of complementarity, that something could be two things at the same time, which I'm going to allude later on in the talk. So all of this intro, all of this is in the book, but we wrote the book because the world is facing tremendous problems. This is a list. You can pick whatever you want in there. And all of the things are either opportunities or challenges that we have about energy transitions. The very concept of work is being redefined. The problems that bigger knowledge is being fragmented, bigger problems need bigger teams. Everything is connected. In fact, regarding connection, all of these three, for example, are things connected with connectivity, and connectivity is good and bad. So when we wrote the book, this is sort of the manifesto of the book, that today more urgently than ever, we need to augment our thinking. And basically the book focuses on these things, new ways of thinking, how can we augment our thinking spaces, and a clue is there, art, technology, and science sort of joining up and increasing our thinking space, and how can we master complexity, because the ideas have to be implemented in a world that is becoming increasingly complex. So the book is about basically two things. You see, the book is unusual in many respects. We broke many rules with Bruce Baum. Bruce is probably the most famous designer in the world at the moment. So it's about the augmentation of thinking spaces by the conversion of art, technology, and science. The word new is in there because, as I'm saying, I'll be talking mostly about modern and contemporary art, and then the augmented thinking for a complex world. So the book covers lots of territory, and I'm going to go this. It's about leadership and innovation. People in the business world are interested in this. Creativity, art, complexity, design, science, technology, history of art, the Renaissance, we covered a little bit of that, creative organizations, something that you may not be familiar with, the adjacent possible, emergence, creative longevity, intersections, universities, a whole bunch of things, chaos theory, artificial intelligence, even math, a little bit of physics, engineering, predictions, education. All of that are things connected in here, but at the end, the book is about leadership and innovation, and it's also about individuals and teams. So let me kind of give you a very quick rundown on something that has to do with how technologies evolve. Technologies start in a very timid way. There is a birth of the technology, an idea. At some point, there is a rapid growth, and eventually the technologies maturate. It doesn't have to be one thing. It could be many, many things connecting this graph. So for example, in here, I'm showing you things that have to do how to record data or sharing data, starting with calligraphy, writing, fountain pens, eventually typewriters of different kinds, mechanical, electrical, reaching up to the cloud. And technology, sometimes there is a quantum change. In here, for example, you see Harley Davidson's motorcycles. These are in the museum, sort of north of Chicago in Milwaukee. And you see the 1912 motorcycle, one cylinder, leather belt. And suddenly in 1913, two cylinders, which Harleys have up to now, chain belt. And eventually there will be other changes. You can have all the knowledge you want about internal combustion engines, but doesn't prepare for the Harley Davidson electric. So at the root of what I'll be talking about is the idea of thinking modes. And why I'm going to use visual art to exemplify thinking modes. Thinking modes. Because in visual art, the trail survives. I could give you tons of examples about this, but I'm going to show you these. These are some sketches and photographs taken by Picasso's mistress at the point. There were 43 of these before Guernica suddenly was completed. So a piece of art doesn't appear in one shot. There are lots of processes preceding the piece. Some of them are lost, but a lot of them survive. But if I were showing you this series of images of paintings done in between 1910 and 1988, and I will ask you, put them in a chronological order. There is no way that you can do that unless you have taken a course in modern art. By the way, this is the newest by Basquiat. This is the oldest by Kandinsky. There are two pictures in here that were done by the same artist. And again, if you have no clue about history of art, you will never guess, because the two pieces done by the same fellow, Gerhard Richter, are this and this. There's more technology, for example, in designing chairs. But again, If you look at materials, probably we can look, well, plastic was not available in 1910. But again, it will be very hard to put an arrow of time on this unless you know something about design and something about architecture. So in art now, there's really not a concept of evolution as you could see in science or even technology. I love this quote by the late critic of the New Yorker, Peter Scale, that says the modern, postmodern, and post-postmodern may have been the last recognizable periods in modern art. Then those movements too disintegrating, it has been pretty much one dumb thing after another one ever since. So this is a little figure that encapsulates the birth of evolution of a technology, but technologies are followed by other technologies, and you don't wait for one to die before replacing by the other one. Eventually, if you smooth them out with some kind of this jagged line representing revolutions, you get to this picture, and this picture basically encapsulates the evolution of technology and science. And art, modern art, is more like this. It's not like this, a direction of progress. In art is constant reinvention, in technology is continual adaptation with disruptions, and science, which has been really open source since the advent of professional journals, the philosophical transactions of Royal Society, builds over the past, disruptions are infrequent. So the point is, in science, the idea that you build standing on the shoulders of giants is a good idea. In technology, the only reason to stand on the shoulders of an elder giant is to crush the elder giant, your technology to replace the other one. And in art now, it's a bad idea to stand close to anybody. Derivative is not a bad word in technology. Adaptation, remixes are good. The iPhone doesn't have any new technology when it appeared. It was just combining things in an artful way. And the important thing here is that at the two extremes, you have two different ways of thinking. And we're all blend of this, but this is a metaphor. The brain is much more complicated than this. That's why I call it the whole brain metaphor. You have a way of looking at things that is rational, left brain, analytical, convergent parts, decomposing problems, and an external part, which is intuitive, creative, metaphorical, divergent, which is the right brain thinking. And these two are two different ways of seeing the world. Nexus thinking, in some sense, is seeing things in different ways at once. Now, there are ways that help with this, and this figure with science in here, with the words that sort of encapsulate the purpose of science, is discovering, technology with invention. Art, more controversially, put creation, but it's not only that. Science is fine, discovery, technology, invention. All of this part is the left brain, this is the right brain. Design, and this is one of the reasons that we push for design, at least here in McCormick. In some sense, what I could tell you is that everything that I tell you about the Nexus, I have been able to operationalize some of these ideas in the context of education here. Design kind of links the things, and that's the purpose of putting design first. Now, the idea that art, technology, and science, it would be a good idea to connect them is not a new idea. In about 1950, there was a journal launched by a fellow named Harry Holzman in the US that had this really fantastic sort of manifesto. Transformation affects or affirms that art, technology, and science are interacting components of the total human enterprise. But today, remember this is 1950, today they are often treated as they were cultural isolates and mutually antagonistic. Transformation will cut across the arts and sciences by treating them as a continuum. Well, the journal was a great idea, lasted for 3 issues. These are the cover of the 3 issues of the journal. Unusual, the format. He commissioned pieces from a who is who in the art science world, Le Corbusier, Einstein, Piet Mondrian, Pierre Boulez, John Cage, de Kooning, Buckminster Fuller. So this, I want to give credit to the first person, one of the first, who had the idea of seeing the continuum of art, science, and technology. So in the book, what we do is, if there are modes of thinking that have to do with these verticals in art, technology, and science, we compare them along different dimensions, and is invariably the modes of thinking of technology are bracketed by science and art. Now, it's hard to show you all the book at once, but this will try to kind of capture that. So the book starts with a sort of opening credits, if you want, a series of images. The book starts here, and each chapter starts with an image. And chapters are pretty dense because they are side notes, and there are lots of images. These are the two that I show you in the presentation. And all of them focus on a theme, like creativity at the nexus, our views of creativity, shaped by basically a lot of what people think about creativity, and especially art, is still shaped by the Renaissance and the Romantic period, okay? But this is why myths about the long creative genius and bursts of inspiration stay with us today. And then there is a whole bunch of examples about domains that have converged, producing these collective outputs of products and ideas. So Florence was one. It's probably the most vivid example of the intersection of thinkings and the remarkable output that produce in terms of ideas connected with art, technology, and even science with Galileo. So the nexus thing, the nexus thinking, requires also that if we have these two different lenses to see the world, at some point these lenses will conflict. And nexus thinking requires dealing with conflicting views. This is a consequence of seeing the world with two different lenses. And the ability of embrace and recognize and benefit from opposite viewpoints is something that I'm borrowing here, an idea that comes from quantum mechanics and its complementarity. And it has to do with the fact that the only way to reconcile that light could be a wave in some ways of interacting or traveling, and particles when interacting with matter, but light being both of them, it depends on how we examine things. The idea that something could be two things at once in quantum mechanics goes by the name of complementarity. So one thing that they are considered apart is chaos and order. But chaos and order, in fact, could coexist. And this is what I'm going to show you very quickly about explaining complementarity and explaining what is complicated and complex. So complicated systems, all the ones in the left, are the ones designed with a blueprint. If you design a nuclear submarine, where every tiny little screw will go is determined by the blueprint. The central sort of archetypical example of a complicated system is a clock or a watch. So all of those are designed with a blueprint. The blueprint doesn't evolve, it's fixed. The systems on the right are things in which the system organizes itself and produces something which is more than the sum of the parts. You can study a fish to death, and you cannot, from that, deduce that fish will organize in schools like this. Or you can study a termite to death and not discover how termites actually organize to produce mounts like this. Or the ultimate example is you can study neurons to death and you'll never be able to understand how neurons connected together organizing themselves in the brain, produce consciousness. So complicated systems, they have blueprints, they even have a user manual to guide repairs. Complicated systems do not adapt, but complex systems are robust. They can fail more gracefully. They can tolerate imperfections in some sense. They can learn to solve new problems and evolve. And ecology is an example of a complex systems. They are contextual in the sense that one part can evolve to become something else, like stem cells can take many functions. So, but the central idea of a complex system is that from these fish or neurons, you can produce a school of fish or a brain. And this is what is called emergence. And so the lessons, there are many lessons that one can derive from complex systems. The two that I put in there is organization can emerge without a central control or blueprint, but that chaos and order can coexist. And that's one example of complementarity. So this, in some sense, when we were talking about domains of art, science, technology, and lessons that one domain can impart on the other one, this is a very powerful lesson stemming from science. But there are other lessons stemming from art. So in the lessons that cross domains, I show the ones from science, but there are several coming from art. So the one that I'm going to sort of exemplify here, these are all that are explained in the book, is one that has to do with a series of lithographs produced by Picasso in about 1944-45. So this is one series of images from Picasso, and we end up in here with what we call the final image. But the way that Picasso did this was in the order which I'm going to show you now. This is December 5, 1945, December 12, 24, January 2nd, January 10, and this is the last one. So this is the whole sequence, and you can go in one way to show evolution from simple to complex, in the other one from complex to simple, from the whole bull to the few lines that represent the bull, or from the few lines that represent the bull to the whole bull. And by the way, Picasso was not the first one who was doing something like this. I do not know, but I suspect Picasso knew that the Theo von der Berg, who was very connected to the whole intellectual milieu of art in the 30s, 40s, 50s, produced a series of sketches called not the bull, the cow. Starting from these at the beginning, eventually ending here, and he claims this is the last one. So what's the lesson in here? The lesson is being able to learn to see simplicity in complexity, something that has many, many pieces and you isolate the essential aspects, or to see complexity in simplicity, how one idea can give rise to many other ideas. One example that I like to give is the last sentence in the paper by Watson and Crick about unraveling the structure of DNA. The last sentence was, "It has not escaped our attention that the structure so proposed, the coping mechanism of DNA, can have interesting biological consequences." Well, all biotechnology emerges from that little picture, okay? So another lesson from art, which I think is super important in my view, is these are sketches from a painting that became La Danse from Matisse. There are only a few. He did a lot of these, and eventually the final painting of La Danse is this. This is in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg in Russia. But Matisse was one of the giants of the 20th century art. He had a long, long life, and not every day, he painted every day, not every day that he went to his studio, he was particularly inspired. So sometimes he painted what he had lying in his studio. And in there you see a painting, you see part of a chair and a stool, flowers, but behind that, there is a painting that he had at that point, which was La Danse, and here's another example. So what's a lesson that you can draw from this, from one of the giants of 20th century art, Henri Matisse? Inspiration is overrated, okay? The only way to produce something good and eventually magical is to be working constantly on things. There's another lesson that the third one that I will give to you. This is Picasso. This happens to be at the MoMA in New York. It's a bronze sculpture, but it's produced by putting together a whole bunch of objects that Picasso had lying in his studio. So for example, the head of this Baboon and Yang is the name of this sculpture, is two toy cars. The eyes are handles from broken jars or pitchers. The belly is bottom pants. So what the lesson is in here? The lesson is that you have to adopt things, adapt them, and eventually with those things, this is especially important in technology. Once you see the whole, if you have created something good, the individual pieces disappear. They are subsumed by the central concept. I do not know if this, I always have to explain this because I don't want to give ideas to steal ideas and plagiarism in here, but the bad artist copy, great artist steal, in the context of what is up there, that you put things together and you create something amazing. I think this is a lesson from art that goes to really technology. Now, if I have to give one example of some of these lessons, art, technology, and science, putting things together, maybe not creating new science, maybe incrementing things gradually in technology, I would say that George Lucas and all the consequences that emanated from Star Wars is probably one amazing example of a Nexus organization, because these created innovations in art, in sound, in technology, industrial light and magic, and you can come up with your own examples, but the ultimate example of this in the past, there are places that Vienna tried to capture this at some points, Edinburgh, but the place that is the most amazing example of the convergence of art, technology, and science is Florence. There were other parts in Italy. Basically, all the city-states had examples of this. Galileo was in Padua for a while, in Pisa, that's where he did some of his experiments. But the idea that art, technology, and science, by joining up, produce an amazing possible output of idea is the central to this book, The Nexus. So the final thing that I want to give, the sort of meta lesson, is that we go through life looking at things with one pair of glasses, often very successfully. I mean, you go to law school, for example, to learn how to think like a lawyer. Education is the way of producing in our brains a neatly set, organized library that allows us to see things with a particular lens. But having the possibility of another pair of glasses or another pair enriches our thinking. And that's what is the whole point of the book, is that there could be a new augmentation of thinking spaces by the intersection of art, technology, and science. The word new, I didn't explain it much in here, but it would have been hard to team up with artists in 1930 because they are, at that point, artists were more like cultural aristocrats. Think of Stravinsky or Picasso himself. But artists now are more entrepreneurial than ever. And that's why the word new appears in there. And I try to give you a sense of the augmented thinking for the complex world by mastering some of the things that people know about complexity. So this is all that I wanted to say. I wanted to do this in about 45 minutes, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio. Are you able to take a few questions? You have some time?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So that was quite a smart work that we covered. It obviously has a lot of implications where we are, what we're trying to do. It represents and reflects the narrative of this class, all the different schools at Northwestern that are reflected here. And so this is a great opportunity. Who wants to ask the first question?
Yeah, the sound is not great, so make sure you speak slowly.
Yes, yeah. We are aware of that, Julio. Unfortunately, not every place has the same technological infrastructure that Northwestern does.
Yeah. I hope the doc.
Yes.
I hope you heard me okay, but
no, we heard you perfectly. We heard you perfectly.
Yeah. Okay. So ask anything.
Questions. Okay, Mia, identify yourself and which school you're from and get closer to this. I think it'd be easier to make sure. Okay. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
My name is Mia. I'm studying violin and psychology, and I'm in Benin and Weimar. I was curious of what made you even think about this integration between art, science, and technology. Do you have a background in art? And I'm just curious of what made you think about this.
I give you the short answer. I was blessed. My father was in science. I grew up around microscopes and things like that. And my mother was a classically trained artist. So I learned things without really knowing that I was learning them. I started by painting before deciding that if I wanted to make a living, probably, it was a time in which I grew up in Argentina. The possibilities that you had, they were so much more limited than now. So, but I went into more math, physics, engineering. I always saw the beauty in math, but these ideas have been with me forever. It was only after meeting with Bruce that I went to him and I showed him a little table with art, technology, and science, 3 columns and the things across, that I decided that I need to write this. And then the way that we explain this is the book was 15 years of coffees and conversations and 2 years of Zooms that somehow we put this together. It was, I written 2 other books. This was by far the most complicated one because I had to hire a company to handle all the art permits. You don't go and reproduce something from Malevich or or Pollock. You have to really go through all permits. But the idea was always there. And I think people now have much more an opportunity to merge in these worlds than when I was growing up, in which the boundaries between domains were so much sharper.
Yes, I'm gonna hear it. Make sure we have another question coming up.
Sure, yeah.
Hello, good evening.
Hey, how are you?
Nice to meet you. My name is Mahmoud. I'm here studying CS in Weinberg. I had a question more about like the vision we would hope to see for Northwestern in terms of like combining all the topics we talked about today. Because I know other schools like the University of Southern California have programs like the Alvine Young program that like try to combine like arts, science, and innovation and business. And I was wondering, like, you know, Northwestern, we have the Siegel Institute and so many new programs emerging, trying to combine all the things we talked about. Like, what would you hope to see for our school?
I don't know if anybody has. There are programs that are, they will claim to combine art, science, and technology in some sense, and you find this in pockets of USC, but it's usually resides in one subset of the university and doesn't go everywhere else. The idea here was that I mentioned that one element that helps you integrate things is design. And design within McCormick is obligatory, okay? But we have been teaching this for the last 10 years to small subsets of people. In McCormick, it's called design thinking and communications. And in what it has been for other schools is design thinking and doing. But the opportunity of connecting programs or students that in one course you can find people from anthropology, sociology, computer science, law, Kellogg, medicine. There are many of these programs, and they are mostly run through the Farley Center. The earliest one was, and the only one that is legislative, was called Innovation Medical, in which is the only one that is kind of Soviet-like, because it's to McCormick, to Kellogg, to law, to medical school. That's the only one that is sort of restricted. The other ones could be from everywhere, and one of those is called Innovation Art, is taught from Farley. A lot of the people there are from the art sides of the university. But I think that the only problem really is you want to absorb as much as you can in the 4, maybe 5 years, if you extend things, that a rich environment of a university has to offer, and it's short, the time to absorb all the components. But I love when, for example, we have had people from set design coming and teaching in engineering, or people who do costume design, who have designed costumes for operas at the Metropolitan, for example, come and team up with someone here to do something together. So I think you have to use the flexibility that the place offers, but there is not one specific course that will contain all the components together. I think you have to pick and choose. In some cases, in some programs, at least here, we allow people to design their own majors. You have to kind of pass a bar, which is a high bar, so that's not why so many people do it. But the idea is the components are there, and it's now becoming more the culture of the place that you can fuse the things and do it. oddly enough, one place where these ideas have penetrated is in parts of Kellogg. I'll be probably teaching more there than before. Okay, Nashir, anything else?
Yes, we have another question. Thomas?
Yeah.
Hi, Professor. I'm a rising sophomore studying industrial engineering. I was kind of wondering, like you mentioned, how Picasso's quote, like about how good artists borrow and great artists steal. I was kind of wondering, like, what you think, like, the implications of AI kind of have on this, and like whether you think, you know, even better artists will use AI, and then kind of like the implications of that, you know, in technology, I guess the rest of the ideas discussed in the book. Thank you.
Okay, so there are several things in this. One part of the question I will identify on in what ways the frontiers of technology can help art or artists in producing new art. And this has been going on for a long while. In fact, there are two exhibits now, one at the MoMA and one maybe in LACMA in LA, about the early attempts in the 60s to use computers for art and this. And so there's a long tradition of that. The second, and in many respects, what we want to do is benefit from the people who are doing this. So we have had courses where people from art theory and practice teach with us. I have very good friends in the department. And I feature at least two people, Mike Rakovitz and Inigo Ojalvo, in the book. So technology and art, there's a really nice intersection. As to AI and art, the things are so fluid now. I have been asked to comment on AI and art. I mean, one thing that you could say is that if you use AI as an aid, that's one thing. If you think that AI can produce new art, that's another one. AI, for all the wonders that it has, is retrospective. It uses everything produced up to now. And the question is, can it produce something that is a break from the past? And that's a high bar to pass. A question that you could ask is if AI, as is now, would existed in the year 1900, and you are feeding all the history of art to AI in 1900, whether or not AI will have been able to produce cubism. And the answer is probably no, because the whole point of art until 1900 was that art was representational. Abstraction didn't exist. So it's a very interesting domain to operate in, ask questions, but I see all technology eventually gets absorbed by art. At some point, photography was declared the mortal enemy of art until artists embrace it, and no one questions that anymore. The same thing will happen with all technological advance. So the question now with AI, which goes beyond art, is the question of is a distinguishing between two words. One is intelligence. And there's no question that AI could be in some way intelligent. But the second one is creative. And intelligence doesn't imply creativity. So I will leave it at that.
Okay. You have a question? Who else has a question? I have a question for you, Julio.
Sure.
No one else does. I'm going to get closer here. So one of the things that I've observed that you've done during your leadership as dean is very often in your speeches and when you're trying to champion an argument, you have drawn upon using network visualizations to talk about potential collaborations, perhaps in line with Nexus thinking, whether it is with McCormick, whether it's with the other schools at Northwestern. In a lot of cases, you've used network visualization as an argument for what you're trying to argue. Given that this class is focusing on social networks and network science, I would love to get you to tell us why you chose to use networks as a way to help make arguments or to point out strengths, but also in some cases to point out weaknesses in these situations. And even if you look at McCormick, you have network visualizations that you put on space. Okay, go ahead.
So I included one network. Well, I included several network images in the book, but one of them is that came associated with a show that was produced at the MoMA, was to show the network of artists in around 1940, 1950. And at that point, the network was defined as people who had either exhibited in the same locations or people who exchange correspondence with each other, okay? And what you will see is that even with those limited ways of communicating, just writing a letter or having been in the same art show, people were part of a network in which each part influenced the other parts. There is some art which is called outsider art. People who are completely outside the system, but those examples are usually, I would call, pathological examples. They are very, very rare. But the idea that a network produces outputs which are greater than what the individuals could produce separately, and this in science and art and technology, and you being part of this network, is the whole point of actually the Nexus. There are examples in which someone in complete isolation can produce something amazing. I am thinking of pure math, for example, or maybe in some instance, something connected with poetry, but more than ever, people are enriched by the surroundings. You may give value to the network, and this applies even to the students in an organization like Northwestern. You enrich the network by your presence, and the network enriches you. So how to draw and engineer collaborations within a network is the path to increase and better outputs, in my view. So you need to kind of think strategically on looking at components of these networks and sometimes bringing components that were sort of minimally connected, connecting them more is how ideas, the best ideas, no question about, happen at intersections. And this, what implies necessarily is connecting parts of networks which were not connected, and you have to kind of make an effort to put these pieces together.
Very good. Thank you so much again, Julio. It's past our time here, so let's join and give a round of applause to Julio.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye, Noshir.
Have a good rest of the day, and thank you again. Congratulations on a fantastic book that I recommend this book to.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.